Hi everyone, welcome back to Tech Talk with Bill. My name is Bill, and on this channel, we'll teach you JavaScript fundamentals for absolute beginners and anyone who's basically shifting careers, especially those coming from a non-technical background. On our demos, we use a ServiceNow personal developer instance, so you can safely execute on this environment, make it as your laboratory, and everything you will learn here is pure JavaScript logic that works. And if this is your first time in my channel, for you to follow along, I have created how to set up a developer environment that you can basically found at the end of the screen. One of the most common beginner question I see is the loop is working, but you really don't know why it's working, how it is working. And that is dangerous because JavaScript will often let you write code that runs but does not do what you think it's doing. And that establishes confusion. And that shows up very clearly with our topic today, which is a for off loop and a for in loop. So I've created this lesson for JavaScript aspirants who are absolute beginners, career shifters, and anyone who still feels unsure about the meaning of loops in JavaScript. And if loops feel overwhelming, you are the exact audience that this video is for. If you want slow, structured, and long-form JavaScript lessons like this, consider joining as a channel member. Your membership supports the channel and will help me unlock deeper walkthroughs like this. And before I write any code, I like you to have a mental model, and I want you to lock this in. A for of loop gives values, and a for in loop gives keys or indexes. And I like to prove this to you line by line. And before learning any new loops, I like to anchor your understanding of a classic for loop. And your journey in learning as a developer, you should be able to read code one line at a time. The first line that you see on line 2, we are creating an object or an array of objects, which is just a list of data or values stored in order. The ability to read code line by line and understand what's happening establishes business context in advanced capabilities that the code is doing as expected in alignment to the business requirement. Now the next line, which is on line 5, we manually create a counter called I, and we initialize it or start at 0 because numbering in tech starts at 0. We stop when I reaches the length of the array, then we manually increase I on every loop. So dot length is a function of an array where you will see if I type out on line 3 and do a dot, and you will see the different functionalities of an array. And for you to be really good on how array works, you need to get your hands dirty and test the different functionalities of this JavaScript object. So it will relate to your JavaScript object-oriented programming skill set to be able to implement and test the array of objects or the function inside of an array object, which was created by JavaScript themselves. And I have a full lesson coming about JavaScript objects and functions, which is a full lesson that will give you the ability to create objects of your own, at the same time be able to read the out-of-the-box JavaScript objects that will definitely augment your skills and allow you to design any application inside the JavaScript environment. As we move forward, we manually increase I on every loop. So that is what the I++ basically means, an incremental object that adds number as you loop along. And I have more examples about arrays and loops on my previous lessons. Then inside the loop, we are executing code on line 8 where we basically print the index. The gs.print is a ServiceNow JavaScript object, and this prints the current position. In the next line, we use the index to fetch the value from the array. And this loop works, but you must manage everything by yourself. And the common question is, if you did not put it there, then in the technology world, it basically does not exist unless you put it or build it or created it. Because now, as a developer, you are now designated as a builder. And I want to remind you about the environment. All examples run in scripts background, which is a JavaScript ServiceNow object. We do not use console.log. In our example, we always use gs.print. And as you follow along, I'd like you to run this script and be able to tell me in the comments what is the outcome of this printed example. It will give you clarity on how the script works. And in addition, I always like to remind you to learn code is to get your hands dirty. You see, you understand it, but you have to make mistakes. And the more mistakes you have in coding, the better you become as a JavaScript developer. Now let us move forward from a classic for loop to a for of using the same array. As you can see on line 5, it has showed a red squiggly line because the for of is supported in a more advanced browser versions, which is the ECMAScript 2015 or ES6. So now to be able to ensure that it works, we have to change our versions in application type that supports ES6. And if you want to follow along, I have created an application where ServiceNow specific ES6 version. Now let us go back to explaining line by line. So again, we are establishing or creating an object. I'd like you to get familiarized with the terminologies as you become a JavaScript developer. So it's an object or array of objects containing data, which is the different kind of fruits. And as you move forward and become advanced developers, you may be consuming a collection of data coming from a database. And will be always the case on this aspect, coming from a list of objects. And in the next line, JavaScript automatically walks the array. Each time the loop runs, fruit becomes the actual value. Inside the loop, we print on line 8 each fruit from the collection. And we are printing the value directly with no index and no lookup. So this loop reads like plain English, where for each fruit inside the fruits, and now print the fruit using the for loop object. So now you will notice as I hover it, so this is very important, that you are looking at a collection or a list of data, which is fruits. And now there is a conversion happening behind the scenes as you loop each line of the collection. So you have fruits, and there's a loop on each line of the table or the row on each table, then print each row in the loop inside the table. So I hope that makes sense. So you're coming from a collection, narrowing down to a single row of data inside the table. And I'd like you to imagine that because a lot of developers get confused. So if you say an object of an array of objects, so it represents a collection of table or rows or records. So you have this example that you say, do apologize for my drawing. So you have the column header and you have the different records inside. So having that mental model and being able to understand what you're basically trying to print. So you have the counter, which is 0, 1, 2, and 3, and basically you have the records inside. And as you do a more complex loop, then the indexing will also make sense to you because you are iterating to a collection of records, which you are representing inside the fruits object. So now the naming convention will now make sense as well. Since if you are looping to a number of students, then you are putting in a correct naming convention then this will be students, and what is the record of that student in the record of students. And as you become more familiar with loops, then you'll have a mental model how the search capabilities like Google is designing their implementation of doing a search and how basically loops work. So on this third example, we are reinforcing the for of with numbers. And as you notice that a loop is always coming from a collection of data or records, list of records, and so on. And there are scenarios that you only have one record, but stored in a type of list of records. And now you will see the quality of the implementation and asking the why. I only have one record and a list of records is basically being used or an array of objects. And that is where your skill starts to kick in because you get to understand the meaning of the different types of a variable. Since variable is also an object and we are storing an object inside the object, right? So this is an array of objects and we put information or data inside the variable. So in a nutshell, right, to make your life easier, IT is quite limited because it can only process information. And without information, then the tech industry, even AI, can do nothing. And let's move forward with our lesson. So as we create a list of collection on line 2, so the next step, which is you guess it on line 5, each loop, which is the score that represents a single record, is the number itself. And as you print this script, running the run script button, you get to print the value directly. And again, it only prints values only. And let us have more example. And I'd like you to fully understand that strings or an object is also iterable. So you can iterate. So I'll repeat that word, iterable. So let me type that down, iterable, because you can loop in or iterate. So you get to familiarize on the tech jargons in JavaScript development. So the word Java on this aspect, a string is also just a sequence of characters. So you have a collection of characters, and as you hover, it's a type string. And you can also loop on a type string, and each loop, the letter becomes one character. And our intention now here is we print that character. And you guessed it, this will print J, then A, then V, then finally A. Now, on our next example, we're going to move forward with the for in, and now we're finishing off with the for of. In for in, it does not give values. It gives indexes for arrays and keys for objects. Think about it as a location and not as a content, right? So that mental model that you're putting into your head, right? So let us have an example. And we have an array of objects, a list of cities, or a list of records of cities. So interchangeably, you can utilize those description, and they are one of the same. So line by line, again, you are just looping or iterating from a list of objects or collections, which is coming from line 2. And we have created an example as a start off of looping into a list of records. Now, as you see on line 5, the index becomes 0, 1, 2. And as we move to line 8, the gs.print prints the position and not the value. And the gs.print on line 11 prints the city's index. So on this approach, we must manually fetch the value. And this is extra work for you, but it gives you more control depending on the depth of the object. So meaning you have a list of records that I showed you earlier coming from a table. And this is how the technology looks at the list of records. So the complexity of your data, now I'm going to make it complex, as I said, complexity. This can be a 1D, 2D, 3D, 4D data, and so on. And this technology gives you the ability to index what you're trying to print. And since you have a list of records, and you can be looping in thousands of records, hundreds of thousands of records, then you start with 0 index, 1 index, 2 index, and 3 index, and so on. And then you basically print the value of that record. And as you can see that you have a two-dimensional data that start with 0, then you have a row column, a row of records and a column of records. And the question is, what part are you basically printing? And right now, eventually, you have a single record, which have different indexes, which is 0, 1, and 2. And from there, as you print the index, you can also print the value of the index using this type of code. And not to confuse you, so you have cities here and you have index. Since this is a variable name, you can rename it as city. But since you are printing an index on this example, that's why we name it as index. So I'd like you to test this yourself, make mistakes, and see how this code basically behaves. If you do it once, you do it twice, and you do it more, then it becomes second to you. Then you get to understand how this JavaScript code basically works. So now as you do a mental model, I'd like you to always remember that you are iterating to a list of records or a collection of data. And this collection of data can be created by another person, another company, and so on. And now your job as a developer is to understand the dimensions of that data, and then your arrays and loops will basically work correctly. And it's all about familiarity. Knowing these techniques will give you the ability to loop in any type of design of a collection of records, because you can be collecting data from a 2, 3-dimensional record. And as you get more experience, then it becomes easier for you. So I'll give you another example here to deepen your familiarity. So let's change this and drill down to a person object that we have established on line 2. So we represented the table earlier. So you have the bucket, right? So you have a column and you have the value, right? So you have one record, single record, and we have 3 columns, and we have put it in an object or a variable. So it's the same. We are implementing the same approach, but now it's a different structure. And at the end of the day, it's all about a collection of data. And if you look at it that way, then you will not get lost. It's all about list of records, collection, and as you drew that mental model, right? Then that table that we always draw, right? So you have the column and you have the record, and since we have only one record, right? So this is 0, 1, right? Then you have the row view, right? And you have the column view. And as you do that, right? So right now we have 3 columns, 1, 2, 3, right? So this is not existing on this example, but at this moment, this is the representation, and now we are basically saving it to a bucket, a variable which is person, and now we are iterating to this person object. So line by line explanation as we move forward to line 9, the key becomes the name and the role experience becomes person index key that retrieves the value. As we basically look along on each specific record, then we have the index, we print the index, and now we print the value. And I think it's starting to make sense to you now as you run the scripts. And on this next example that I'd like you to see, it's the same data, but we're having two loops. And this is a good exercise for someone new like you. And this single example proves everything. And I'd like you to print or respond in the comments on how did this go in your laboratory experience. So the for of, it focuses on the values, while the for in basically uses indexes. So for best practices, you use for of oftenly for arrays and use for in for objects. Avoid for in for arrays unless index is required. Always ask, what is the loop or the type of variable the loop is basically receiving? Then it will help you decide. So in summary, today you've learned why a for of exists and also for in and how beginners basically misuse them. And it will help you, this whole lesson helps you how to choose confidently what the technology is for. So the key takeaways, values is specific for of, and keys and indexes you utilize for in. And as you familiarize and get your hands dirty, you get to understand how a for of works and also a for in. So memorization in programming does not work because it's all analytical and being able to understand how the flow of code works and how the technology is basically behaving. And if you want more lessons like this, I'd like you to join as a member, continue to the next JavaScript lesson, watch the environment setup video so you can follow along. And if you're coming from a non-technical background, this is exactly how real understanding is built. Slowly, clearly, step by step. And I want to see you in our next lesson.